When Eddie came to the crumbling church searching for the ghost of his missing uncle, he expected only silence, dust, and maybe a trace of peace. But it was his dog, Kaiser, who found something entirely different. Eddie had never seen him act like that before. Ignoring the scent of dust and decay, Kaiser moved with an eerie sense of purpose straight toward the altar. He began to claw at a single floorboard, his nails tearing through the dead silence with a sharp, hollow sound. Every instinct of the Marine in Eddie told him to trust the dog. He thought he was prying open a forgotten memory. But in truth, he was opening the door to a 20-year-old murder and sending a deadly invitation to those who would do anything to silence him forever. Support us by subscribing to the channel. The quiet of Eddie's small apartment was a carefully constructed fortress against a world that was too loud. It was a silence with weight, built from routine and the steady, comforting presence of the dog sleeping at his feet. Eddie, a man in his late 30s, had the lean, wiry strength of a former Marine, a frame that still held the discipline of service. His brown hair, cut short, was showing early signs of silver at the temples, and his face, though marked by a deep kindness in his eyes, was etched with lines of hardship that made him seem older than his years. His life moved in a predictable rhythm. Wake, walk the dog, work his remote data entry job, walk the dog again, sleep. It was a life of deliberate stillness, a necessary antidote to the chaos he had once known. His only constant companion in this fortress was Kaiser, an 8-year-old German shepherd whose coat was a magnificent blend of silver and charcoal gray. Kaiser was not a pet, but a partner. He had served alongside other handlers in the military before retirement, and he moved with a quiet dignity and an unnerving intelligence. His loyalty to Eddie was absolute, an unspoken pact between two souls who understood the language of silence and watchfulness. The peace of that Tuesday morning was broken by the sharp clatter of the mail slot. Kaiser's head lifted instantly, his ears swiveling towards the sound, but a low rumble in his chest was the only response. He looked to Eddie for his cue. Eddie sighed, running a hand over his face. Bills, junk mail, another circular for a grocery store he never visited. He moved to the door and picked up the small pile of envelopes. Among them was a thick, cream-colored envelope, stiff with official documents. It was from a law firm in Bend, Oregon. He did not know anyone in Oregon. He slit it open with a kitchen knife, his movements methodical. As his eyes scanned the dense legal text, the stillness in the room began to evaporate, replaced by a thrumming uncertainty. The words swam together. Tom Holloway. Last will and testament. Sole surviving heir. Declared legally deceased. Tom Holloway, his mother's brother. A man he barely remembered, a ghost from a life before the military had reshaped him. Tom was a journalist, an idealist who chased stories about environmental causes. He had vanished 20 years ago, sometime in the early 2000s, while on assignment deep in the Cascade Mountains. After a massive search turned up nothing, the world had moved on. Tom became a faded photograph, a sad family story. Eddie had been a teenager then, already dreaming of the discipline and purpose the Marines promised, too wrapped up in his own future to fully grasp the finality of his uncle's disappearance. Now, 2 decades later, that ghost had returned. He was the sole heir to his uncle's property. Eddie read the address, a rural route number outside a town he had never heard of. Oak Ridge, Oregon. He reread the letter, then a 3rd time. Kaiser had risen from his spot and now stood beside his chair, resting his heavy head on Eddie's knee, sensing the shift in his human's carefully maintained calm. Eddie stared out the window, his gaze unfocused. He owned nothing but his truck, his clothes, and the gear in his closet. He had no roots, no attachments beyond the noble creature beside him. The inheritance itself, whatever it was, held little appeal. He had learned to live with very little. But the name, Tom Holloway, echoed in his mind. It represented a piece of his family, a connection to a past he had long since walled off. Perhaps in that forgotten place in Oregon, there was an answer. Not about his uncle's disappearance, necessarily, but an answer for himself. a chance to find a silence that was not empty, but peaceful. "What do you think, boy?" Eddie murmured, his hand stroking Kaiser's neck. "Feel like a road trip?" The journey from his quiet corner of California to the heart of Oregon took 2 days. The landscape shifted from brown, sun-baked hills to the towering evergreen sentinels of the Pacific Northwest. With each mile north, Eddie felt a layer of his self-imposed isolation begin to peel away, replaced by a nervous anticipation. He knew nothing about what he would find. The lawyer on the phone had been professional but vague, describing the asset as a small, private parcel of land with a structure. The town of Oak Ridge was nestled in a valley, dwarfed by the immense dark green mountains that surrounded it. It was the kind of place where time seemed to move more slowly. Eddie parked his truck in front of a classic general store, its wooden sign faded by decades of sun and rain. He needed to get the keys and a more precise map to the property from the store owner, who was also acting as the local caretaker for the law firm. As he and Kaiser stepped out of the truck, a damp, earthy smell filled the air, a mixture of pine needles, wet soil, and wood smoke. A few people on the sidewalk paused to watch them, their gazes lingering a moment too long. Eddie was an outsider, that much was clear. The inside of the store was dimly lit, with dusty shelves stocked with everything from canned goods to fishing lures. An elderly man with a kind, wrinkled face and a full head of white hair stood behind the counter. He introduced himself as Mr. Harrington, the store's owner. "You must be Mr. Connor," he said, his voice a gentle rasp. "Lawyer called and said you were on your way." "Eddie is fine," Eddie replied, his voice quiet. "I've come for the keys." Mr. Harrington nodded slowly, his eyes flicking from Eddie to Kaiser, who stood patiently at Eddie's side. He seemed to hold a certain respect for the dog's calm demeanor. He reached under the counter and produced a heavy, old-fashioned iron key attached to a simple wooden tag. "There you are," he said, placing it on the counter. "I drew you a map on the back of this receipt. Cell service is spotty once you get off the main road." "Thank you." The lawyer wasn't very specific. "What exactly is the property?" A strange look crossed Mr. Harrington's face, a mixture of pity and something else, something like caution. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. "It's the old St. Jude's Church, or what's left of it." Eddie frowned. "A church?" "Aye, built back in the day, maybe 100 years ago, for a logging community that used to be up in those hills. Big timber boom back then, but the company went bust. The people moved on, and the forest took it back. It's been sitting empty for the better part of a century, except for your uncle, of course. He bought it and the land it sits on a little over 20 years ago. Said he needed a quiet place to write." Mr. Harrington paused, wiping the counter with a cloth that had seen better days. "Folks around here always thought it was a strange place to live. Spooky. Some say it's haunted by the ghosts of that old town." Eddie felt a chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air. A profound sense of gloom seemed to hang over the town's description of the place. It wasn't just old, it was forgotten, swallowed by the wilderness. It was exactly the kind of place a man could disappear from without a trace. He took the key and the map. "Thank you, Mr. Harrington." "You be careful up there, son," the old man said, his gaze serious. "The woods are beautiful, but they keep their secrets." As Eddie and Kaiser walked back to the truck, the feeling of being watched returned. The gloom wasn't just in the long shadows cast by the mountains. It was in the wary eyes of the people, in the hushed history of a church abandoned by man and reclaimed by nature. He wasn't just inheriting a piece of land. He was inheriting a mystery, a silence that felt far older and deeper than his own. The map Mr. Harrington had drawn was simple, but the journey it described was a slow regression through time. The paved county road soon gave way to a gravel track that rattled the frame of Eddie's old truck, sending dust billowing in their wake. After another few miles, the gravel dissolved into a dirt path. 2 deep ruts carved into the earth, hemmed in on both sides by a dense, unyielding wall of forest. The canopy of ancient Douglas firs and western hemlocks was so thick that it cast the path in a perpetual twilight, the air growing cooler, heavier, rich with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. Kaiser, who had been resting quietly on the passenger seat, now sat up, his posture alert. His nose twitched, sampling the complex tapestry of scents pouring through the open windows. He let out a low, soft whine, a sound of keen interest rather than distress. Finally, the ruts faded into nothing, blocked by a fallen giant of a tree that had likely been there for years. This was as far as the truck could go. Eddie cut the engine, and the sudden, profound silence was almost deafening. It was a living silence, filled with the faint rustle of unseen things in the undergrowth and the distant whisper of wind high in the treetops. "Well, boy," Eddie said, his voice sounding unnaturally loud. "Looks like we walk from here." He grabbed a small pack with water and a flashlight, then let Kaiser out. The dog immediately began to explore, his movements efficient and purposeful, his nose sweeping the ground. According to the map, the church was less than a mile in. The path, however, was barely visible, a faint suggestion of a trail all but erased by time and nature. As they began to walk, Eddie's military training kicked in, his eyes scanning, observing, analyzing. And he quickly noticed the contradiction. The decay was authentic. Moss grew in thick green carpets over fallen logs, and ferns sprouted from every patch of damp earth, but the trail itself felt managed. In some places, branches seemed to have been deliberately pulled across the path, their ends unnaturally broken. In another, a series of heavy stones formed a barrier that felt too neat, too intentional to be a random rock slide. It was subtle, but to a man trained to spot inconsistencies in terrain, it was unmistakable. This path had not just been forgotten, it felt like someone had actively encouraged the forgetting, carefully drawing a green curtain over its memory. It was as if someone wanted to ensure that no one would ever stumble upon this place by accident. After a 15-minute walk through the deep woods, they saw it. The church did not appear suddenly, but rather emerged from the forest as if it were a natural part of it. It was a small, simple structure, its wooden siding weathered to a silvery gray, the steeple long since stripped of its cross, now just a pointed finger aimed at the sky. Ivy and moss crept up its walls, and a sapling grew defiantly from a crack in the roof. It was surrounded by a small, overgrown clearing, a silent testament to a community that had long since vanished. The sight was strangely beautiful and deeply melancholic. This was St. Jude's, a sanctuary that had lost its flock and been left to the quiet ministry of the forest. Eddie felt a knot tighten in his chest. This was his inheritance, a ghost of a building in the middle of a haunted wood. He walked up the 3 stone steps, the iron key feeling heavy and cold in his hand. He slid it into the lock. It protested with a screech of rusted metal, but finally turned. With a push of his shoulder, the heavy wooden door groaned open, releasing a breath of stale, musty air that smelled of dust, decay, and forgotten time. The interior was a tableau of arrested decay. A thick, uniform layer of dust, the accumulation of 2 decades, coated everything, softening the sharp edges of the pews and the altar. Sunlight, tinted green from the forest outside, streamed through the broken panes of the stained glass windows, illuminating swirling motes of dust in its beams. The silence in here was different, heavier, more absolute. It felt sacred and sorrowful all at once. It was clear that his uncle, Tom, had lived here, but his presence was little more than a whisper. A simple cot was tucked into a corner, a small wood-burning stove stood cold, and a stack of old magazines from the late 1990s sat on a crate. It was a space that had been left in a hurry, abandoned to the slow, patient work of entropy. Eddie walked slowly down the central aisle, his boots leaving the first clear prints in the dust in 20 years. He ran a hand along the back of a pew, a fine powder of dust and disintegrating wood clinging to his fingers. He felt a profound sense of loneliness, not just for himself, but for his uncle. To live out here, in this crumbling shell of a place, one had to be either seeking profound peace or running from something terrible. It was then that he noticed Kaiser. His partner had not followed him down the aisle. Instead, the dog stood just inside the doorway, his body rigid, his head held high, his ears twitching as he processed the sounds and smells of the old building. He seemed deeply unsettled. After a moment of intense stillness, Kaiser began to move, but not with his usual calm curiosity. He moved with a singular, urgent purpose. Ignoring the pews, the cot, and the intriguing smells of a place long untouched by humans, Kaiser walked directly toward the front of the church, his claws making soft clicking sounds on the dusty floorboards. He stopped before the raised platform where the altar stood, a simple wooden table draped in a rotting cloth. Here, his agitation grew. A low, guttural whine escaped his throat. He paced back and forth in a tight semicircle, his nose pressed to the floor, sniffing intently. "What is it, boy?" Eddie asked softly, his voice echoing slightly in the empty space. "Smell a mouse?" But Eddie knew it was not a mouse. He had seen Kaiser on the trail of animals before. This was different. This was the same focused intensity the dog displayed when searching for a hidden object during training exercises. Kaiser stopped his pacing and fixed his attention on a single spot right at the base of the altar. He sniffed the area one more time, then looked back at Eddie, a clear question in his intelligent eyes. When Eddie did not move, Kaiser turned back to the floor and, with a startling deliberateness, began to scratch at one of the floorboards with his front paw. It was not a frantic, destructive scratching, but a firm, insistent gesture. "Here," the action seemed to say. "Look here." Eddie's heart began to beat a little faster. Every instinct he had, both as a Marine and as Kaiser's partner, told him to trust the dog. He walked to the front of the church and knelt beside his companion, placing a hand on Kaiser's back to steady him. He looked down at the spot the dog had indicated. It looked like every other board, old, gray, and covered in dust. But as he looked closer, he saw that the edges of this particular board seemed to have a slightly wider gap than the others, and the nail heads, unlike their neighbors, were not sunk deep into the wood, but sat almost flush with the surface. It was a place designed to be opened. With a growing sense of dread and anticipation, Eddie pressed his fingers into the gap and pulled. The board was loose. Just as Eddie's fingers found a purchase on the edge of the floorboard, the world outside seemed to conspire with the moment. A low, distant rumble of thunder echoed through the mountains, and the soft green light inside the church dimmed as the sky darkened. The first drops of rain began to fall, fat and heavy, spattering against the remaining shards of stained glass and drumming a soft, insistent rhythm on the old roof. The sound amplified the silence within, making the small, forgotten sanctuary feel even more isolated, a wooden ark adrift in a sea of ancient trees. The rain seemed to grant Kaiser a renewed sense of urgency. The dog let out a soft whine, nudging Eddie's arm with his nose as if to say, "Hurry, it's here." Eddie took a deep breath, the air thick with the smell of coming rain and old dust. He braced himself, planting his feet, and pulled. The board resisted, held fast by 20 years of settled stillness. He pulled again, harder this time, his muscles straining. With a final agonized groan of protesting nails and splintering wood, the board came free in his hands. He tossed it aside and peered into the darkness below. It was not the raw earth he had expected to see. Instead, he saw a small, rectangular hollow, about 2 feet deep, that had been carefully lined with flat, gray stones. It was a purpose-built hiding place, a secret vault designed to protect its contents from the damp and the decay of the forest floor. And nestled in the center of this small, stone-lined tomb was a dark green, metal box. It was an old ammunition can, the kind Eddie had seen 100 times during his service. It was chosen for its durability, its waterproof seal, a soldier's solution for protecting what mattered most. A fresh wave of rain swept over the church, the drumming on the roof growing louder, more insistent. The storm had arrived. With Kaiser watching his every move, his silver-gray form a statue of tense anticipation, Eddie reached into the secret recess and lifted the box out. It was heavy, its weight promising substance, a density of secrets. He set it on the floor in front of him and examined the latches. They were stiff with disuse but not rusted through. He worked them with his thumbs, and they sprang open with a sharp metallic snap that cut through the sound of the storm. He paused for a heartbeat, his own breath catching in his throat. What had his uncle deemed so important that he would build a hidden vault beneath the altar of a forgotten church to protect it? He lifted the lid. The contents were nestled tightly inside, seemingly untouched by the passage of 2 decades. The first thing he saw was an old manual 35mm camera. It was a workhorse model, simple and rugged. He picked it up. It felt solid and real in his hands, a tangible link to the man he barely knew. He instinctively checked the small window on top. The film counter read 24. The roll was not finished. The story Tom had been documenting had been cut short, mid-sentence. Beneath the camera lay a thick, leather-bound journal. It was a sturdy, high-quality notebook, the kind a serious writer would use. Eddie lifted it out. Its cover was cool and slightly damp to the touch. He opened it, and his hope for easy answers immediately vanished. The pages were filled from margin to margin with his uncle's handwriting, but it was not plain text. It was a complex, seemingly random assortment of letters and numbers, a dense cipher that stared back at him, utterly incomprehensible. Tom had not just recorded his secrets, he had locked them away behind a wall of code. The final item in the box was a topographical map of the Cascade Mountain Range, folded into a neat, tight square. Eddie carefully unfolded it. It was a professional surveyor's map, incredibly detailed, showing the rise and fall of the land in intricate contour lines. Across its surface, his uncle had made his own additions in red ink. Certain areas were circled, routes were drawn, and cryptic notes were scribbled in the margins. It was a battlefield map, Eddie realized, a strategic overview of his uncle's investigation. He laid the 3 items on the floor before him: the camera with its unfinished story, the coded journal with its locked-away truths, and the map with its silent strategic markings. Together, they formed a complete set, a time capsule of a man's last dangerous days. Eddie leaned back on his heels, a profound sense of awe and sorrow washing over him. He looked at Kaiser, who had finally relaxed his tense posture and was now sitting peacefully, as if his duty was done. And in that moment, Eddie understood. The question that had been nagging at him, how, was finally answered. It was the scent of the past. A human nose could never have detected it. After 20 years sealed in a metal box and buried under a floor, any smell would have been far too faint for him to perceive. But not for Kaiser. The dog's powerful olfactory senses, millions of times more sensitive than his own, had picked up the faintest, most subtle of chemical signatures seeping through the floorboards. It was the slight acidic tang of the silver halide emulsion on the old camera film and the specific organic scent of the animal hide glue used in the binding of the old leather journal. These were not the smells of a forest. They were the smells of human secrets. "You found it, boy," Eddie whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He reached out and wrapped his arms around the dog's strong neck, burying his face in Kaiser's thick gray fur. "You found it." The dog leaned into the embrace, letting out a soft, contented sigh. Outside, the rain poured down, washing the world clean, while inside the dusty, forgotten church, the secrets of the past had finally been brought into the light. The storm raged on, encasing the old church in a world of roaring wind and drumming rain. Inside, the only light came from a battery-powered lantern Eddie had brought, casting a small, warm circle of yellow in the vast, dusty darkness. The 3 artifacts from the metal box lay before him on the dusty floor: the camera, the map, and the coded journal. The camera held a story he could not yet see, and the map showed a landscape he did not yet understand. The journal, he hoped, held the key to it all. He picked it up, the leather cool and smooth beneath his fingertips. He settled onto the floor, leaning his back against a solid wooden pew with Kaiser resting beside him. A warm, reassuring weight, against his leg. For the next hour, Eddie immersed himself in his uncle's secrets, but the secrets were unyielding. The code was unlike any simple field cipher he had encountered in the Marines. It was not a substitution or a transposition. It was a dense, intricate system, a language invented by one man to speak only to himself. Frustration began to build in him, a familiar feeling of hitting a wall he could not break. He was about to set the journal aside when, flipping through the pages, his fingers brushed against a page that felt different. Tucked deep in the middle of the book, one single page was written not in code, but in plain, clear English. It was not a record of facts or evidence, but a raw, unfiltered glimpse into his uncle's state of mind. Eddie leaned closer to the lantern light, his eyes tracing the elegant, slightly frantic script. October 12th, 2003. The forest is watching me. I used to find solace here, in the silence of the old trees. Now the silence has teeth. I feel their eyes on me when I walk the trail, the unseen observers who own this land in shadow, if not in deed. They are patient. They move like ghosts through the undergrowth, leaving no trace but a snapped twig, a misplaced stone. I am not a soldier, but I am beginning to understand what it means to be hunted. The loneliness of this fight is the heaviest burden. To know a truth so monstrous and to be utterly alone in that knowledge is its own kind of prison. The trees do not judge, but they bear witness. I only hope I can give them a voice before mine is silenced for good. The words struck Eddie with the force of a physical blow. He read the entry again, and then a third time. The hair on his arms stood on end. The feeling Tom described, the oppressive weight of being watched, the isolation of a silent war, the sense of being a lone operative in enemy territory. It was a language Eddie knew intimately. It was the cold dread of a night patrol, the gnawing tension of knowing a threat was everywhere and nowhere at once. For the first time, Tom Holloway was not a faded photograph or a sad family story. He was a man, a fellow combatant in a different kind of war, and his fear, his loneliness, echoed across 2 decades to find a home in Eddie's own scarred heart. The wounds of his own past throbbed with a sudden, painful recognition. A low growl from Kaiser broke the spell. The dog lifted his head, his body instantly tense, his gaze fixed on the church's front door. A moment later, Eddie heard it too. The sound of a vehicle, its engine laboring as it churned through the mud of the forest track. He immediately swept the journal, camera, and map back into the metal box, slid it under the loose floorboard, and nudged the board back into place with the heel of his boot. He stood up just as a pair of headlights cut through the gloom outside. A large, official-looking SUV belonging to the county sheriff's department had pulled up as far as it could. A figure emerged, a man holding a large black umbrella, and began walking towards the church. Eddie moved to the door, his hand resting on Kaiser's head to keep him silent. He opened the heavy door a few inches and peered out. The man was large, with a soft-looking middle that strained against the buttons of his tan uniform shirt. His face was round and clean-shaven, fixed in a smile that seemed too wide, too practiced. It was Deputy Sheriff Jim Hopper. "Afternoon," Hopper shouted over the rain. "Just making the rounds. Wanted to check on our new resident, make sure you're all right in this storm." Eddie felt a cold knot of suspicion in his gut. A routine check all the way out here in a storm like this? It made no sense. "I'm fine," Eddie said, his voice flat, not opening the door any further. "Mind if I come in for a second? Get out of this downpour?" Hopper asked, his smile unwavering. Eddie knew he could not refuse without raising even more suspicion. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Come in." Hopper stepped inside, shaking his umbrella and sending a spray of water across the dusty floor. He looked around the desolate interior, his eyes lingering on Eddie's simple setup. "Cozy," he said, the word dripping with a condescending sort of pity. "Heard you were Tom Holloway's nephew. Shame what happened to him. He was a bit of a troublemaker, you know, always stirring up things with the logging companies, spinning these wild conspiracy theories." Eddie remained silent, his expression unreadable. Kaiser stood beside him, a low, barely audible growl still vibrating in his chest. Hopper seemed to take Eddie's silence as an invitation to continue. He ambled down the aisle, running a hand over a dusty pew. Folks around here just want to live and work in peace. They don't take kindly to outsiders coming in and telling them how to manage the forest. He turned back to Eddie. Funny thing is, a few years after your uncle vanished, Murray Bauman, the man who owns most of the timber operations around here, he bought up every other private parcel on this mountain. Big conservation project, he called it. Every single one, except this old church. Guess your uncle's estate was too much of a legal mess for even him to bother with. The name, Murray Bauman, landed like a stone in the quiet church. Hopper had delivered the information like a piece of idle gossip, but Eddie knew it was a calculated move. It was a test, a probe to see what he knew. "I appreciate you checking in, Deputy," Eddie said, his voice firm, a clear dismissal. Hopper's smile tightened slightly. "All right then. You stay safe out here, son. It's a long way from anywhere." He turned and walked back out into the rain. Eddie watched until the SUV's red taillights disappeared into the forest, then firmly bolted the door. An hour later, the rain had softened to a steady drizzle. The immediate sense of threat had passed, but a deep unease remained. Acting on an instinct honed by years of service, Eddie decided to check his supplies. He had left a large, military-grade water container just outside the church, tucked under the eaves to keep it out of the worst of the weather. He unbolted the door and stepped outside into the damp, clean air. He found the container right where he had left it, but as he bent to check the spigot, he saw it. Near the bottom, almost hidden in the shadows, was a small, perfectly round puncture. It was not a crack from being dropped or a hole chewed by an animal. It was a clean, deliberate hole made by something sharp, like an ice pick or an awl. A slow, steady trickle of fresh water was seeping out, darkening the earth around the base of the container. The warning. It was a quiet, insidious message. It said, "We were here. We can get to you whenever we want. We can take away the very thing you need to survive, and you will never even see us coming." Eddie stared at the tiny hole, and the last of his detachment, his desire to remain a passive observer, was washed away. The personal words in his uncle's journal, the deputy's veiled threats, and now this. This was no longer just about uncovering the past. The echoes from his uncle's lonely fight had found him, and they had become his own. This was now a mission. The discovery of the punctured water container was a quiet declaration of war. It stripped away any lingering hope Eddie had that he could simply uncover the past and leave. The past was not buried, it was alive, and it was watching him. He now understood with chilling clarity that he was isolated in a way that felt hauntingly familiar. He was an operative behind enemy lines, with no backup and no one he could trust. Taking the roll of film to a photo lab in town was no longer an option. It would be like handing over his only piece of intelligence to the enemy. He retreated into the cold, damp sanctuary of the church, bolting the heavy door behind him. The rain had subsided, leaving a dripping silence in its wake. Kaiser, ever watchful, sat by the door, a silent sentinel. Eddie's mind, honed by years of strategic thinking, began to work the problem. If he could not go to the outside world, he would have to bring the solution here. He retrieved the metal box from its hiding place. He had been so focused on the journal and the map that he had only given the other contents a cursory glance. Now he examined everything with meticulous care. His uncle had not just been a writer, he was a methodical man. Tucked beneath the camera was a small canvas roll-up pouch tied with a leather cord. Eddie unrolled it on the floor. Inside was a compact, portable film developing kit. There was a Patterson developing tank, a changing bag made of thick black fabric, several small amber-colored glass bottles with faded handwritten labels, developer, stop, fixer, and even a small red safe light bulb. It was the kit of a dedicated amateur photographer, someone who loved the craft enough to practice it even in the most remote of locations. Deeper in the pouch, he found another small, thin notebook. This was not the coded journal. This one was filled with notes on photography, shutter speeds, aperture settings, and on the last few pages, something that made Eddie's breath catch. It was a series of handwritten chemical formulas and notes titled, "For Developing Expired Tri-X Film." His uncle had not only anticipated the need to develop his own film, he had created a specific chemical recipe to compensate for the film's age. Tom Holloway had been prepared. He had left his nephew not just a clue, but the very tools needed to decipher it. A new resolve hardened in Eddie's chest. This was a task he could manage. It required patience, precision, and a steady hand, skills the military had drilled into him. He needed a darkroom. His eyes scanned the church's interior and settled on a small, narrow door near the altar that he had previously ignored. He opened it. It led to a small, windowless sacristy, a room once used for storing vestments and sacred vessels. It was perfect. For the next hour, Eddie worked with a quiet, focused intensity. He used old, rotting cloths and pieces of loose wood from the pews to seal every crack of light around the doorframe. He worked until the small room was plunged into an absolute, suffocating blackness. This was the kind of darkness that felt physical, where the only thing you could trust was the sense of touch. He brought the kit inside, along with a bucket of the precious, remaining fresh water. With the door sealed, he sat on the cold stone floor and unzipped the changing bag. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was the most critical step. He placed the camera, the developing tank, and the film reel inside the light-proof bag. He zipped it shut, inserted his hands into the two elasticated cuffs, and began to work blind. The process was agonizingly slow. He had to open the back of the camera, carefully remove the film canister, and then feed the delicate curling end of the film onto the spiral grooves of the plastic reel. His fingers, clumsy in the darkness, fumbled with the fragile material. He could feel the sweat beating on his forehead. One mistake, one kink or fingerprint on the emulsion could destroy an image forever. He focused on his breathing, slowing it down, just as he had been taught to do before taking a difficult shot. Finally, he felt the entire length of the film slide onto the reel. He placed the loaded reel into the tank, sealed the light-proof lid, and only then did he allow himself to pull his hands out of the bag. The rest of the process could be done in the dim, ghostly glow of the red safe light. He mixed the developer according to his uncle's precise formula, his hands steady as he measured and poured. He started a timer on his watch. For the next several minutes, the only sounds in the world were the soft sloshing of liquid as he agitated the tank and the steady, quiet breathing of Kaiser, who was lying just outside the sealed door, a faithful guardian keeping watch. He moved through the steps, developer, stop bath, fixer, and a final, long wash with the clean water. With each step, the anticipation inside him grew. He was not just processing film, he was coaxing ghosts from their 20-year slumber. At last, it was done. With trembling hands, he opened the tank and carefully lifted out the wet, glistening reel. He unspooled the first few inches of the negative strip and held it up. In the faint red light, it was difficult to see anything clearly. He carried the dripping strip of negatives out into the main hall of the church, holding it carefully by its edges, and walked over to the lantern. He held the strip in front of the warm, yellow light. The images, reversed in black and white, were faint but clear. The first few frames were of the forest, stunning photographs of ancient, majestic trees that conveyed a deep love and reverence for the wilderness. Then the tone shifted. The next series of photos showed the brutal reality of what was happening. He saw massive tree trunks, clearly bearing the small metal tags of a protected forest reserve, being felled by chainsaws. He saw heavy machinery dragging the timber through the scarred earth. It was stark, undeniable evidence of a crime on a massive scale. His hands began to shake as he moved to the final few frames on the strip. The images became chaotic, blurry, taken in haste. The perspective was low to the ground, as if Tom had been discovered and was shooting from a concealed position. Then the final frame. Frame number 24. It was a perfectly focused, full-frame image, a close-up. It was the face of a man, his features contorted in a mask of pure, unrestrained fury. His mouth was open in a silent shout, his eyes blazing with rage. One of his hands was raised, blurred with motion, as if he were about to strike the camera, to strike the man holding it. Though 20 years younger, the face was instantly recognizable from the few photos Eddie had seen in the general store. It was Murray Bauman. Eddie stared at the image, his blood running cold. This was not just a photograph. It was a confrontation. It was a record of his uncle's last defiant act, not running, not hiding, but raising his camera to document the face of his own killer. The abstract mission had just become terrifyingly concrete. The enemy now had a face. The morning after the storm broke with a deceptive calm. A cool, clean light filtered through the broken stained glass, painting the dusty floor in fractured jewels of color. The air was fresh, washed clean by the rain. But for Eddie, the world had been irrevocably altered. The silence of the church no longer felt peaceful or even lonely. It felt like the held breath before an ambush. He had spent the night in a state of heightened vigilance, sleeping in short, restless bursts, while Kaiser lay alert at the foot of his cot. The strip of negatives, now dry, was his most precious possession. He had rolled it carefully in a piece of clean cloth and sealed it within a small, waterproof pouch he always carried in his pack. It was now a part of him, a dangerous truth he carried with every step. The coded journal and the map were back in their metal box, once again hidden beneath the altar. The face of Murray Bauman, contorted in that silent 20-year-old scream of rage, was burned into his memory. It was the face of a man who did not tolerate obstacles. It was the face of a predator whose territory had been invaded. Eddie knew, with the certainty of a soldier who has studied his enemy, that his presence here would not be tolerated for long. The punctured water container had been a question. His continued presence was the answer. Now he waited for the response. It came late that morning. Kaiser heard it first, of course. The dog, who had been dozing in a patch of sunlight, was on his feet in an instant, a low, guttural growl rumbling deep in his chest. His body was a rigid line of focused muscle, his ears locked forward. Eddie was beside him a moment later, listening. It was the sound of a powerful engine, not the strained whine of the deputy's SUV, but the deep, confident purr of a high-end vehicle navigating the forest track with ease. Eddie moved to a grimy window, peering through a clear shard of glass. A late-model, immaculate dark gray pickup truck, the kind that cost more than most cars, was pulling to a stop where the path ended. A man stepped out from the driver's side. He was tall and trim, probably in his early 60s, with a full head of thick silver hair that was perfectly styled. He wore expensive tailored outdoor clothing, a dark green waxed cotton jacket, moleskin trousers, and sturdy leather boots that looked both practical and incredibly costly. Even from a distance, he projected an aura of absolute confidence and control. It was Murray Bauman. Eddie's heart hammered against his ribs, but his mind went cold and clear. The enemy was not sending a soldier, he was coming himself. This was not an attack. This was a parley, a performance. "Stay," Eddie commanded Kaiser in a low, firm voice. The dog stopped his growl, but remained standing, every line of his body radiating suspicion. Eddie walked to the heavy door, unbolted it, and stepped outside, letting the door swing shut behind him. He stood on the top step, positioning himself on higher ground, a small but significant tactical advantage. He folded his arms across his chest and waited. Bauman walked the trail with an easy, athletic stride, as if he were strolling through his own backyard. As he drew closer, Eddie could see the details of his face. It was handsome, with strong features, a tanned complexion, and eyes the color of a winter sky, pale, clear, and cold. A carefully crafted, charismatic smile was fixed on his lips. "Mr. Connor," Bauman said, his voice smooth and pleasant, carrying easily in the quiet air. "My apologies for intruding. I'm Murray Bauman." He extended a hand. Eddie met his grip. Bauman's handshake was firm, dry, and brief. "I know who you are," Eddie said, his tone neutral. Bauman's smile did not falter. Of course, in a small community like this, news travels fast. I was so sorry to hear about your Uncle Tom. I knew him, you know. Not well, but I knew him. A very passionate man. He had a deep love for these woods. The words were perfectly chosen, respectful, and sympathetic. The play had begun. He cared a great deal for this place, Eddie said, offering nothing more. Indeed he did, Bauman continued, his gaze sweeping over the dilapidated church. Which is why I've come. Mr. Connor, I understand this property is now yours. I would like to make you an offer to purchase it. As you can see, I own most of the surrounding land, and I've been turning it into a private nature conservancy. I want to ensure this beautiful forest remains pristine for generations to come. Your uncle's land is the last piece of the puzzle. I am prepared to offer you a price far above its market value. Let's say $500,000, cash. The number was staggering, deliberately so. It was not a real estate offer, it was a bribe. It was the kind of money that could make a man forget his questions, forget his family, and walk away without a backward glance. Eddie held Bauman's gaze, his own expression unreadable. That's a very generous offer, Mr. Bauman, but the property is not for sale. Bauman's smile tightened just a fraction of an inch. Perhaps you misunderstand. That is a life-changing amount of money for a structure in this condition. You could buy a new house, a new truck, anything you want. I'm sure I could, Eddie said calmly. But this was my uncle's. It has sentimental value. The air between them grew thick with unspoken meaning. The polite facade was beginning to crack. Sentiment is a fine thing, Mr. Connor, Bauman said, his voice losing some of its warmth, taking on a harder, flatter edge. But it doesn't pay the bills, and this is a very remote place for a man to be all alone. It's wild country, dangerous. There are animals, unstable terrain. Tragic accidents have been known to happen. It would be a shame if your uncle's legacy ended with another tragedy. The threat was no longer veiled. It was laid bare between them, cold and sharp as a knife. At that moment, the church door creaked open a few inches. Kaiser had pushed it open with his nose and now stood in the gap, perfectly silent, his body low, his silver eyes fixed on Bauman. He did not bark or growl, but his presence was a clear, unambiguous statement of menace. Bauman's eyes flicked to the dog. For the first time, his smile vanished completely. "That's quite a dog you have there," he said, his voice laced with a new, colder respect. "He's a good judge of character," Eddie replied. The two men stood in silence for a long moment, the pretense between them shattered. Bauman had come here to assess the man who had inherited Tom Holloway's secrets. He had expected to find someone he could easily buy off or intimidate. He had found neither. Finally, Bauman gave a short, humorless laugh. "You're a stubborn man, Mr. Connor, just like your uncle." He turned, his entire demeanor changed. The charismatic landowner was gone, replaced by the ruthless tycoon from the photograph. The play was over. "The offer stands," Bauman said over his shoulder as he walked away. "But it won't stand forever. Think carefully about what's worth more to you, a pile of rotting wood or your future." Eddie watched until Bauman's truck disappeared, its powerful engine a fading growl in the vast silence of the forest. He stepped back inside the church and bolted the door, his heart pounding with the adrenaline of the confrontation. He knew with absolute certainty that Murray Bauman's next move would not be an offer. It would be an assault. The confrontation with Murray Bauman left a cold residue in the air, a metallic taste of fear and adrenaline. Eddie knew that the man's departure was not an end, but the beginning of a new, more dangerous phase. Bauman's play had failed, and now the gloves would come off. Eddie was no longer just a curious nephew. He was a threat, a loose end that needed to be tied. His greatest weaknesses were his isolation and his lack of information. To survive, he needed to break that isolation. He needed to find a crack in Bauman's armor. His mind went back to the conversation with Deputy Jim Hopper. Murray Bauman owns most of the timber operations around here. Bought up every other private parcel on this mountain. An idea began to form, a long shot, but the only one he had. He needed to know more about Bauman's empire, about his operations, about his public face. He also remembered something else, a detail he had barely registered during his trip to the general store. Pinned to a cluttered community bulletin board had been a flyer for a local nonprofit organization, the Cascade Mountain Conservancy, protecting our wilderness for tomorrow. And at the bottom, in smaller print, Aris Bauman, Director. The name had seemed like an odd coincidence at the time. Now it felt like a potential pressure point. Why would a man ruthlessly exploiting the forest for profit allow his own son to run an organization dedicated to saving it? Eddie could think of only two reasons. Either it was a brilliant piece of public relations to make the Bauman name seem environmentally friendly, or it was a genuine point of conflict within the Bauman family itself, a cracked legacy. Either way, it was a lead. The next morning, under a sky the color of slate, Eddie made his decision. He carefully hid the real evidence, the negatives, the journal, the map, deep within the church. He took only a single, small, low-quality print he had made of the final photograph, the one of Murray Bauman's enraged face. It was his ace in the hole, a card he would play only if the gamble seemed right. He and Kaiser left the sanctuary of the woods, the journey back to town feeling fraught with a new kind of tension. Eddie found himself scanning the trees, watching his rearview mirror, his senses on high alert. Kaiser seemed to feel it too, sitting upright in the passenger seat, his ears constantly swiveling, his gaze missing nothing. The office of the Cascade Mountain Conservancy was not in the main part of town, but tucked away on a side street, a small, unassuming building that looked like it had once been a doctor's office. It stood in stark contrast to the image of wealth and power Eddie associated with the Bauman name. He left Kaiser in the truck, where the dog could keep watch, and went inside. The interior was cluttered, but passionate. The walls were covered with topographical maps, photos of wildlife, and posters from past environmental campaigns. Stacks of books and binders overflowed from shelves, and the air smelled of coffee and old paper. It was the workspace of people who cared more about their cause than about appearances. A young woman at a reception desk, a volunteer with a friendly smile, pointed him toward an office at the end of the hall. The door was ajar. As Eddie approached, he heard a voice from inside, a man's voice, raised in anger and frustration. He was clearly on the phone. "No, I will not sign off on it," the voice said, laced with a desperation that made Eddie freeze in his tracks. "I don't care if the permits are in order. You and I both know what that land is. Those are old-growth cedars, Dad. Some of them have been standing since before this country was founded. It's not a resource, it's a cathedral." Eddie stood motionless, hidden from view. He knew he was eavesdropping on a deeply private moment, but he could not force himself to move. The voice continued, responding to the unheard person on the other end of the line. "A legacy? You call this a legacy? Paving over the last wild places for another line of profit? That's not a legacy, it's a crime. I will not be a part of it. I will not lend my name, or the name of this organization, to legitimize what you're doing." There was a long pause. "Then do it," the voice said, suddenly quiet, defeated. "Pull the funding. You always hold that over my head. Maybe it's time you finally did." The call ended with a sharp click. A moment later, a heavy book hit a wall with a loud, frustrated thud. Eddie took a steadying breath and knocked softly on the doorframe. "Excuse me," he said. The man inside looked up, startled. He was in his late 30s with the same strong facial structure as his father, but where Murray Bauman's features were hard and controlled, his sons were etched with a weary idealism. He had dark, troubled eyes and the same silvering hair, but his was unkempt, as if he'd been running his hands through it all morning. This was Aris Bauman. "Can I help you?" Aris asked, his voice strained. "My name is Eddie," he said, stepping into the office. "My uncle was Tom Holloway. I was told he did some research in this area years ago. I was hoping you might have some of his old files." Eris's expression shifted from frustration to a guarded curiosity. "Tom Holloway. I remember the name. He disappeared a long time ago. A tragedy. I was just a kid." He gestured to a filing cabinet. "You're welcome to look, but our records from that far back are spotty at best." Eddie pretended to search through the files, giving Eris a moment to compose himself. He could feel the turmoil rolling off the man in waves. He was a son trapped in the shadow of a father he both loved and despised. He was a man of principle being forced to compromise by the very person who should have been his role model. Eddie recognized the look in his eyes. It was the look of a man fighting a war on two fronts, one against the world and one against himself. He knew he had to take the risk. "Actually," Eddie said, turning from the cabinet, "there's something else. A more sensitive matter. It concerns my uncle's disappearance." Eris's eyes narrowed. "What about it?" Eddie reached into his pocket and pulled out the small folded photograph. He did not say a word. He simply unfolded it and placed it on the desk between them. Eris Bauman looked down. The initial expression on his face was confusion, which quickly morphed into disbelief, and then, finally, into a dawning, soul-crushing horror. He stared at the image of his father's face, captured 2 decades ago, twisted into a mask of pure violence. The sound that escaped his lips was not a word, but a choked, ragged gasp. He stumbled back as if struck, knocking his chair over, and leaned against the wall for support. He did not deny it. He did not question it. His reaction was one of pure, unadulterated pain. It was the face of a man who had perhaps suspected a terrible truth his entire life, but had never been forced to look it directly in the eye until this very moment. I didn't know," Eris whispered, his face pale, his eyes filled with a sudden, terrible grief. "I always wondered, but I never knew." Eddie had his answer. He had found the crack in the Bauman legacy, and it was a chasm. He had not gained an eager ally, but he had found something far more potent, a man whose conscience had just been violently awakened. Eddie drove back from town in a state of grim clarity. The encounter with Eris Bauman had not brought him relief, only a heavy certainty. He had gambled and won, but in doing so, he had tipped his hand. He had shown the Bauman family that their darkest secret was no longer buried. The carefully constructed piece of Murray Bauman's empire, a piece built on a 20-year-old crime, was now threatened. And men like Bauman did not negotiate with threats. They eliminated them. As he and Kaiser returned to the dirt track leading to the church, the atmosphere of the forest felt different. The air had grown heavy and still, the light taking on a flat, gray quality that seemed to sap the color from the world. A deep, penetrating chill had set in, a cold that had nothing to do with the morning's dampness and everything to do with the sky above. Eddie, who had learned to read the subtle language of the natural world, glanced up through the canopy. The clouds were a low, bruised-looking ceiling, pregnant with unspoken promises. He spent the afternoon preparing, not for an investigation, but for a siege. He brought in the last of his supplies from the truck, including a heavy-duty flashlight, extra batteries, and the small camp axe he always carried. He secured the doors, not just with the old iron bolts, but by dragging the heaviest of the solid oak pews and wedging them against the frames. He inspected the windows, noting which ones were most vulnerable, which offered the best sight lines to the surrounding clearing. Kaiser shadowed his every move, the dog's usual calm replaced by a quiet, watchful intensity. He seemed to sense the shift in Eddie's demeanor, the transition from contemplative man to calculating soldier. The air was thick with a shared, unspoken tension. They were a unit of two, falling back on the instincts that had been forged in the dust and chaos of a distant war. By late afternoon, the first snowflakes began to fall. They were not the gentle, drifting flakes of a picturesque winter morning, but small, hard pellets driven by a rising wind that moaned through the tall firs. Eddie stood at a broken window, watching as the forest floor slowly began to accumulate a dusting of white. The wrath of the old forest was descending upon them. He knew what the snow meant. It was the perfect cover. It would muffle sound, obscure tracks, and most importantly, it would ensure that no one could get in or out. The old church was now an island, completely isolated from the outside world. There would be no chance visitors, no passing hikers, and no police. Bauman would know this. He would see the storm not as a hindrance, but as a gift. Eddie had shown the photograph to Eris. By now, the son would have confronted the father. The family's fragile truce would be shattered. Bauman would know that he no longer had time on his side. He would be cornered, desperate. And a desperate man with limitless resources was the most dangerous enemy of all. The final hunt was no longer a possibility. It was an inevitability. The storm was his accomplice. As dusk fell, the snow intensified, the world outside the church dissolving into a swirling vortex of white. Eddie turned on his lantern, its warm light pushing back against the encroaching gloom. He sat on the floor, leaning against a pew, the cold wood a stark contrast to the warmth of Kaiser's body pressed against his side. He methodically cleaned his small, legally owned handgun, the familiar, precise movements a calming ritual in the face of the coming storm. He was not afraid, not in the way a civilian would be. The fear was a cold, familiar weight in his gut, a tool to be managed, not surrendered to. This was a tactical problem. The church was his Alamo, a defensible position with solid walls and limited entry points. The forest, which he had spent the last several days studying, was his terrain. He knew its dips and rises, its areas of thick cover, and its open lines of sight. He had the advantage of being the defender, but his enemy had numbers, superior firepower, and the element of surprise. Bauman would not come alone. He would send men, professionals most likely, who knew how to move through the woods, how to work in the dark. Eddie's greatest asset now sat beside him, his head resting on his paws, but his ears constantly twitching, sampling the sounds of the storm. Kaiser was his early warning system, his perimeter defense. The dog's hearing could pick up the unnatural snap of a twig beneath a boot from 100 yards away. His nose could detect the scent of an intruder on the wind long before they were visible. "It's coming, boy," Eddie murmured, his hand resting on the dog's powerful neck. Kaiser responded with a low rumble, a sound of acknowledgement. Eddie rose and began his final preparations. He extinguished the lantern, plunging the church into near-total darkness, leaving only the faint, ghostly light of the snow-reflected sky filtering through the windows. He moved to his chosen position, a dark corner with a view of both the main door and the most vulnerable of the side windows. He settled in, his body still, his senses straining, listening to the symphony of the storm. He and Kaiser waited. The minutes stretched into an hour, then 2. The only sounds were the howling of the wind and the soft, steady breathing of the dog beside him. Then Kaiser's head snapped up. His body went rigid, a low, almost inaudible growl, more a vibration than a sound, emanated from his chest. His eyes, glowing faintly in the dim light, were locked on the front of the church. Eddie's hand tightened on his weapon. He followed the dog's gaze, peering into the swirling white chaos outside the window. He saw nothing. He heard nothing but the wind. But he trusted the dog's senses as much as he trusted his own. They were here. The hunt had begun. The first assault came not with a crash, but with a whisper. A dark shape detached itself from the swirling snow and glided towards one of the tall, narrow windows on the side of the church. Eddie, his eyes already adjusted to the profound darkness, saw the movement as a flicker in his peripheral vision. Kaiser saw it too, but the dog remained utterly silent, his body coiled like a spring. This was not the time for a warning bark. It was the time for a silent watch. Eddie had anticipated this. Earlier, he had looped old, brittle rope from the church bell tower across the lower frames of the most accessible windows, attached to a precariously balanced stack of old metal hymnal stands. It was a simple, primitive trap, designed not to harm, but to make noise. The figure outside reached the window. A gloved hand, holding a small pry bar, began to work at the rotting wooden frame. With a soft crack of splintering wood, the window swung inward. The figure paused, listening, then began to hoist himself through the opening. As his boot touched the floor, it snagged the tripwire. The result was not an explosion, but a sudden unholy clatter as the metal stands crashed onto the stone floor, a sound like a skeleton falling down a flight of stairs. It was catastrophically loud in the echoing silence. In the same instant, a high-powered flashlight beam cut through the darkness from the front of the church, pinning the spot where the intruder had been. Eddie, already moving, fired a single shot from his handgun, aiming not at the man, but at the stone wall a few feet above the window. The crack of the gunshot and the accompanying ricochet of the bullet off the stone was a definitive statement. I am here. I am armed, and I am waiting for you. The intruder scrambled back out the window and vanished into the snow. The flashlight beam from the front snapped off. Silence returned, heavier and more menacing than before. They now knew he was not a helpless victim. The next hour was a war of nerves. They circled the church, their movements nearly invisible in the blizzard. But they could not fool Kaiser. The dog was a living compass of threat. His head would turn, his ears would pinpoint a location, and a low, almost imperceptible growl would alert Eddie. A shadow by the back wall, a crunch of snow near the steps. Kaiser detected them all, allowing Eddie to shift his position to remain a step ahead, a ghost within his own fortress. The attackers changed their tactics. They decided on a coordinated assault. A hail of gunfire erupted from two positions at the front, splintering the heavy main door, sending shards of ancient wood flying into the church. It was covering fire, designed to pin him down. While his attention was fixed on the main entrance, a third attacker, moving with silent professional grace, approached from the rear. This man was smarter than the first. He chose a high, broken stained glass window, a spot Eddie had deemed too difficult to reach easily. Using the stone facade as a climbing wall, the man found purchase and began to pull himself up. He was a dark silhouette against the swirling white outside, a specter of death climbing into the sanctuary. Eddie was focused on the front, his body pressed against the stone wall, waiting for the inevitable breach of the main door. He did not see the new threat. He did not hear it over the gunfire and the howling wind, but Kaiser did. In a blur of silver and gray motion, Kaiser launched himself from Eddie's side. He was not a pet, he was a trained military dog, and in that moment, all his training, all his protective instinct came to the forefront. He crossed the length of the church in a series of powerful, silent bounds. Just as the attacker swung his legs over the windowsill, preparing to drop to the floor inside, Kaiser leaped. He hit the man with the full force of his 85-pound body. The impact was brutal. The attacker was knocked backward, his cry of shock swallowed by the storm. He fell from the window, his body landing with a heavy, muffled thud in the deep snow outside. Kaiser landed deftly on the floor, a low, victorious growl in his throat, and immediately returned to Eddie's side, his duty done. Eddie's hand found the dog's head, a brief, firm squeeze of gratitude that said everything. Kaiser had just saved his life. The battle devolved into a long, brutal siege. The direct assault stopped, but the pressure was constant. A shot would ring out every few minutes, a reminder that they were still out there, waiting. The cold was a physical enemy now, seeping through Eddie's layers of clothing, making his fingers numb, his movements stiff. Exhaustion began to set in, a heavy weight on his eyelids. He and Kaiser worked as a team to survive the long, dark hours. When Eddie needed to rest his eyes to fight off the encroaching fatigue, Kaiser would remain on watch, his warm, solid presence a bastion of loyalty in the cold darkness. When the dog shivered from the cold, Eddie draped his own jacket over Kaiser's back. They were two soldiers in a foxhole, sharing warmth, sharing a watch, bound by a trust that transcended words. They were fighting for their lives, for each other, and for the truth that lay buried beneath the altar. The night was long and the fight was far from over, but as long as they were together, They were not defeated. The hours before dawn are the coldest, the darkest. For Eddie and Kaiser, they were also the longest. The battle had settled into a grim war of attrition. Huddled in the freezing darkness of the church, they were both running on the last dregs of their endurance. Eddie had only a few bullets left, and the gnawing exhaustion was a more insidious enemy than the men outside. Every muscle ached, and a bone-deep chill had settled into his marrow. Beside him, Kaiser shivered, not from fear, but from the relentless cold, though the dog's eyes never left the splintered main door, a low, constant growl vibrating in his chest. They were losing. Eddie knew it with the cold, hard certainty of a soldier assessing a hopeless situation. The attackers were patient. They had the numbers, the warmth of their vehicles, and the knowledge that time was on their side. They were simply waiting for him to collapse from cold and exhaustion. As the first faint pearlescent gray light of dawn began to seep into the sky, filtering through the blizzard, the final assault began. The remaining pew wedged against the main door shuddered as a heavy object slammed against it from outside. Then again and again. A battering ram. The ancient wood groaned, splintered, and with a final explosive crash, the doors burst inward, torn from their hinges. Two men, clad in dark winter gear, stormed in, flashlights mounted on their rifles, cutting through the gloom. Eddie fired twice, the shots deafening in the enclosed space, forcing them to dive for cover behind the pews. Outside, he could hear the deep, confident voice of Murray Bauman, shouting orders. The king had come to oversee the checkmate. Eddie knew he was out of options. They were inside. It was over. He shoved the last of the evidence, the coded journal, deep into the cold wood-burning stove, a desperate final attempt to keep it from their hands. He backed away towards the altar, his empty handgun useless in his hand. Kaiser stood his ground in front of him, a furious whirlwind of silver and charcoal fur, barking with a ferocity that belied his exhaustion, a lone wolf defending his territory to the last. The two men advanced slowly, their rifles trained on him. From the ruined doorway, Murray Bauman stepped inside, his face no longer a mask of civility, but a canvas of cold, ruthless fury. He looked at Eddie with the dead eyes of a predator who had finally cornered his prey. "You should have taken the money," Bauman said, his voice dangerously calm. "You and that meddling uncle of yours. Some things are better left buried." He gave a slight nod to his men. This was the end. Eddie braced himself, his only thought to shield Kaiser with his own body. And then a new sound cut through the air. It was not the howl of the wind or the crack of a rifle. It was a sound that did not belong in this remote, forgotten place. The high-pitched, powerful whine of approaching snowmobiles, accompanied by the deeper roar of heavy-duty engines. Everyone froze. Bauman's head snapped towards the door, his expression of triumph instantly replaced by one of disbelief. Red and blue lights began to flash outside, their strobing beams cutting through the falling snow, painting the interior of the church in terrifying, flashing colors. Seconds later, the clearing was filled with men in the dark green uniforms of the U.S. Forest Service law enforcement, armed and moving with tactical precision. They swarmed the church, shouting, "Federal agents, drop your weapons!" Bauman's men, caught completely by surprise, hesitated for a fatal second before throwing their rifles down. Murray Bauman himself stood frozen, his face a mask of utter ruin as he watched his 20-year-old secret crumble to dust around him. Standing behind the line of agents, his face pale and etched with a terrible, conflicting agony, was his son, Eris. He had led them here. He had made his choice. After seeing the photograph, Eris had been torn apart by a grief he could not name. When the news of the early blizzard had hit, a terrible certainty had seized him. He knew his father. He knew what a cornered animal was capable of. In a final, desperate act of conscience, he had made a call to a trusted friend, a special agent with the Forest Service, telling him everything he suspected. He had saved Eddie's life, but in doing so, he had destroyed his own father. Their eyes met across the chaotic scene, a silent, painful exchange of understanding and ruin. A few days later, the world was quiet again. The storm had passed, leaving the forest draped in a thick, pristine blanket of white. Bauman and his men were in federal custody, and the story of the St. Jude's Church and the lost journalist, Tom Holloway, was beginning to unfold. Eddie, sore and bruised but alive, had decided to stay. He spent his days in the quiet, methodical work of repair. He patched the roof, mended the splintered door, and swept away the last of the dust and decay. With each small act, he was not just fixing a building, he was building a home. Kaiser was always beside him, no longer a soldier on high alert, but a calm companion, dozing in the patches of pale sunlight that now streamed unobstructed through the cleaned windows. It was while he was cleaning the old stone fireplace, intending to see if it could be made to work again, that his fingers found it. One of the stones in the hearth was loose. It was not a deliberate hiding place like the one under the altar, more like a natural cavity, a place one would only find by chance. He worked the stone free, and behind it, tucked into the dark recess, was a small oilskin pouch. His heart began to beat faster. Inside the pouch was a single, folded letter. It was not in code. The handwriting was his uncle's, and the letter was addressed simply to "Whoever finds this." He sat on the floor, with Kaiser resting his head on his knee, and he read, "If you are reading this, it means you have found my sanctuary. I do not know who you are, perhaps a lost hiker, or perhaps, if I dare to hope, someone I love. I will not burden this page with the details of the darkness I have been fighting. That evidence is hidden elsewhere. This letter is not about that. This is my last will and testament, not of property, but of spirit. I want you to know that I found a great peace in this place. These woods, these ancient trees, they are not just a resource to be harvested. They are a cathedral, older and more sacred than any built by human hands. They teach a silent, patient wisdom. I have spent my last days fighting to protect them, and I do not regret it. It has been a good fight. Do not mourn my anger. Mourn the beauty that is being lost. Do not seek revenge for my sake. Seek justice for the sake of the forest. And if you have it in your heart, love this place as I have. Listen to its silence. Watch its seasons change. It will heal you as it has healed me. It will give you a home, as it has given me. Yours, Tom. Eddie finished the letter, tears blurring his vision. He carefully folded the worn paper and put it in his pocket. It was not an accusation, but a blessing. It was the final piece he needed, the voice from the past that gave him permission to build a future. He stood up and walked to the open doorway, looking out at the vast, silent, snow-covered forest. He was not just the inheritor of a piece of land. He was the inheritor of a mission, a caretaker of a legacy of love. He rested a hand on Kaiser's head, feeling the steady, loyal presence beside him. The loneliness was gone, replaced by a profound sense of purpose. The echoes from the past had finally faded, replaced by the quiet promise of a new beginning. He was home. Home is not always a place we find, but a purpose we discover, often through the quiet loyalty of a friend who walks beside us. If the story of Eddie and Kaiser's unwavering bond touched your heart, we hope you'll share it with someone who appreciates a tale of courage. Your likes and comments let us know these stories have found a home, and by subscribing, you become a cherished part of our storytelling family. Our next tale of a veteran and his loyal companion is waiting for you right now on the screen. We hope to see you there.